Okay, here we are again, huh? And I'm shooting a lot of these videos all in a row here in one shot. I'm going to chop them up to kind of see each step as we go and release them like that. But anyway, so we've dealt with replacing the transistors, and we've also dealt with the offset null, which we now have, so we can adjust that. But we still have one glaring problem that a lot of you have probably been screaming at the monitor at your computer screen as you've been watching this, because I know that most of you who are into this realize what one of the major problems is with this amp. Let's look at the scope. Now, believe it or not, this artifact in this amplifier is not very prevalent. As a matter of fact, in order to get it to show up this much, I actually had to reduce the signal into the amplifier by a whole lot so that I can, so right now I'm down to 10 millivolts I'm putting into the amp so that I can see this. And then even to get even closer, I have to go to the magnification, and there we can see that little notch. Now that should be a nice straight slope there, okay? But it's not. And if we go back down to our normal size, you can see that there is that little bit of crossover distortion. And of course we need to deal with that. And that all has to do with the bias circuit. So as you can imagine, what this video is going to be about is reworking the bias circuit so that we can get rid of the notch distortion and have an adjustable bias. Now, let's look a little bit why this is happening. Now, looking at this circuit once again, we've said that we want these output transistors to just be turned on a little bit so they're conducting. And we never want to have a period of time where both transistors are turned off at the same time. We want them to kind of overlap as it's crossing through, your sine wave, from positive half cycle to negative. And if at any time both transistors are turned off at the same time, you'll get that little kink in your waveform. So the idea is to turn these on enough to prevent that from happening, but not so much that it just adds unnecessary heat into the transistors as they're sitting idle. Now, normally the way you do that is the more difference you have in voltage between these two bases, the more these transistors will turn on. So the closer we bring them to ground, the more they'll be turned off. The further away you bring them from ground or from common, the more they'll turn on. These diodes are what set that operating point, because each of them has a set voltage drop of one diode drop. So in this case it would be 600, 700 millivolts. Now that is supposed to be a little bit more than the voltage drop from the base to emitter of these outputs. And unfortunately, these two diodes are just below having enough. So you actually need to have a bigger voltage drop. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is we can't adjust it. So if I added another diode in here and added another diode drop, that would probably go away, but these might be idling a little bit more current than they need to be. Doesn't take a big change here in millivolts to get a big change here in idle current. So what we want to do is we want it to be adjustable. And then the third problem, which is less of an issue, but still nevertheless should be, for good circuit design, these things should thermally track with these. So as these transistors warm up, these should warm up along with it, and what they will do is they will work in equal and opposite directions. So as the bias starts to creep up, the voltage across these will start to creep down, and that'll counteract that current, that bias creep. So here's our goal. We want to make a larger voltage drop across these two diodes. We want to make it a little bit adjustable, and we want it to be able to thermally track with our transistors, our output transistors. And that's the goal. So let's see what we come up with. Now, in a perfect world, we would want to add these bias resistors in here. And these are for current limiting and also for taking up the current difference between these two transistors in the case that they're not properly matched. Now, you normally don't need this this isn't a super necessity when you just have one pair of transistors, but when you have parallel transistors for higher power, this becomes extremely necessary. Now, we're not going to do this right now. We're not going to do this modification. We're going to focus on our bias circuit. And we're not going to mess around with this right now. We're just going to do the bias circuit. And you can see we just made a couple of changes. Number one, instead of using those 1N4148 diodes, we're going to use a UF1004 diode. And the reason being is these diodes thermally track a little more closely to the characteristics of these transistors' base emitter junction. So that should give us a little better tracking if they're thermally coupled. We're going to take these two diodes and thermally couple them to the output to one of the output transistors. We are also going to take a third diode and put it in series, and we're going to shunt that with a 500 ohm potentiometer. So that's going to allow us to either open this up to the full voltage or short it out, or anything in between. So that's going to give us an adjustable bias. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this little tiny circuit in place of those two diodes, and then we're going to put that waveform back up on the scope and see if we can adjust the signal until we get rid of that crossover distortion. Okay, here is what we've come up with. For the first set of diodes up here, D4, I'm replacing it with 3 discrete UF1004s. As it turns out, I'm going to need to have 4 diode drops to have enough adjustment for what we need, because these have a little bit lower drop than the 1N4148s. So I just configured them like this, put some heat shrink over the bottom part. I'll put this really thin heat shrink over here, and then once that's shrunk down, you'll see what we're going to do. And then for the adjustable part, we have this potentiometer and a fourth UF1004. And you can see the center and the one end are tied together. So as you adjust this, that 500 ohms will either close down to 0 ohms and short this out, or open up to a 500 ohm in parallel with this diode. And when it's installed, it looks just like this. Let's see if I can zoom you in a little bit without defocusing. So you can see I have, this is the pot with the diode across it, and it's just in place of the one diode here, D3, or was it D2, I'm sorry. And then D4 over here is connected to those two diodes, and it's heat shrinked, or heat shrunk, however you want to say, right to the heat sink of this one transistor, so it can thermally track. Now what's going to happen is these are going to run warmer than the previous setup, because they're actually going to be conducting some real current during idle. So, and that's normal, that's what we want. So let's see if we can get rid of that crossover distortion now. I have the dummy load, the distortion meter, and the scope all attached to the output of the amplifier. And I'm going to go up here, get this set here. Let's turn the amplifier on. And here we go. And you can pretty clearly see, and I'm kind of zoomed in here a little bit. You can see that notch distortion. Let's turn that pot now. I have it all the way shorted out right now. So let's open this up a little bit. And as I turn it, you can see it's disappearing. And it's all pretty much gone. And we're going to back it off just a little bit. And there we go. Now looking at the voltmeter, we have about 300 millivolts, 308 millivolts on that fourth diode. And if we look at our THD, wow, what happened? Unbelievable, huh? Okay, let's move over to our other one, our unmodified channel. And look at that, 0.5%, because I'm running a very small signal right now. And back to the new channel that's modified. And there you have it. Now touching these transistors, they are above room temperature now. Even with that tiny little, milliwatt signal. And if I feel these ones, they're still cold. They're ice cold. So our bias circuit is doing its job. And looking at DC offset, there we go. Beautiful. Put my mic back on. Well, now I think it's safe to say that this amplifier is right up on par with just about anything out there. And there's one last thing that we're going to do to this. I still haven't decided whether I'm going to... These really need a bigger heatsink. And as it is right now, I think it would be adequate. If you were just going to have a 20 watt per channel amplifier, I think this is where I would stop. Because right now we can get a clean 20 to 22 watts per channel out of this amp, and it'll work all day like that. It'll be fine. If I want to use this transformer at its full potential, and that's going to kind of make this side of the amp, as well as all these capacitors, get way too close to their maximum operating levels. So we would have to upgrade the capacitors, and we would have to upgrade the heat sinks. And while we're putting heat sinks, it probably would be good to do this little mod to add these emitter resistors in here, or we'll just call them current limiting resistors in this case. Now you notice the way this has to be done if we're going to do, well, we'll talk about that in another video. But for right now, we have a very functional, good amplifier. I think you can agree. So until next time, which will be our final video on this series, I wish you all peace, joy, happiness, and good health in your lives. And hope you're enjoying this so far. Stay well, everybody. Bye-bye.